Information is the lifeblood of a free society, and a defining trait of an unfree society is that information is locked away. The lifeblood is sealed off, and the gatekeepers of state control and of censorship are established to regulate information. Before the rise of the internet, censorship often took place through controls of news outlets, on restrictions on the distribution of leaflets. In more extreme cases, it was regulations on speech and even thought. Ancient Rome suffered through this during the reign of Tiberius. The French Revolution had its law of suspects. Communism was defined by its paranoid states that restricted both speech and thought. Now, in all of these, the narratives tended to be the same. Censorship was to protect us against the threats to society. And those pesky threats were always those who spread lies, those who spread dangerous ideas. They were the counter-revolutionaries, the people whose very beliefs were a threat to public health. And the results, in almost all these cases, were usually the same. Just as George Orwell imagined in his book 1984, well, the ministry of truth becomes the factory of lies. You think we learn from all this, that the lessons from history would show us the outcomes of censorship. But if the pre-Marxist philosopher Friedrich Engels said anything of value, it might have been this: the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, a new global policy on censorship was promoted. It was the Infodemic, the information pandemic. The World Health Organization made a call to action to fight the infodemic in April of 2020. It described this as, quote, "It's an overabundance of information, some accurate, some not, that is spreading alongside the COVID-19 pandemic." It described this as a type of information, stating that, like the virus, it is highly contagious and grows exponentially. It also complicates COVID-19 pandemic response efforts. WHO Director Tedros even went a step further and said this: "We're not just battling the virus, we're also battling the trolls." Watch.
Misinformation makes the job of our heroic health workers even harder. It's diverting the attention of decision makers, and it causes confusion and spreads fear to the general public. Just battling the virus, we're also battling the trolls and conspiracy theorists that push misinformation and undermine the outbreak response.
And of course, this was not just empty talk. It rolled out a global plan for infodemic management, and similar protocols became policy, not just for businesses, but for governments as well. YouTube began putting alerts on COVID misinformation at the bottom of videos. Twitter and Facebook were actually deleting content directly. The White House even put pressure on social media platforms to censor quite a few people, actually, but in particular those they labeled as the Disinformation Dozen for their online posts about COVID-19. Watch the White House press secretary at the time, Jen Psaki, publicly call out the platforms on this.
There are also proposed changes that we have made to social media platforms, including Facebook. There's about 12 people who are producing 65% of anti-vaccine misinformation on social media platforms. All of them remain active on Facebook, despite some even being banned on other platforms, including Facebook, ones that Facebook owns. And Facebook needs to move more quickly to remove harmful violative posts. Posts that will be within their policies for removal often remain up for days. That's too long. The information spreads too quickly.
Now look, we later learned from the Twitter files that there were in fact real actions taken to censor these people online. And only now are we learning something else. It turns out much of what was censored turned out to be true. And as for the public narratives and what was true, well, we learned that much of it was not true. History repeated itself. The attempts to eliminate lies ended up crushing truth, and instead allowed real falsehoods to thrive. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg actually talked about this. He admitted it in a recent podcast with Lex Friedman. Watch.
Just take some of the stuff around COVID earlier on in the pandemic, where there were real health implications, but there hadn't been time to fully vet a bunch of the scientific assumptions. And, unfortunately, I think a lot of the kind of establishment on that, kind of waffled on a bunch of facts and, asked for a bunch of things to be censored that in retrospect ended up being, more debatable or true. And that stuff is really tough, right? And really undermines trust.
Scientific assumptions. Is it science if it's an assumption? Look, this failure in information was later explained as just being how science is. It changed over time. The initial findings are not the final ones. This is former NIAID Director Anthony Fauci saying so in September of 2022. Watch.
What happened is that knowledge, evidence, and data evolve. And as it evolves, you have to be flexible enough to change. And that's what science is all about. It's a self-correcting process.
So how has it evolved? Well, we know now. It turns out the face masks just plain old were not effective. The lockdowns did not work. The vaccines were in fact not 100% effective or safe. In other words, real information was censored. Scrutiny of so-called science was forbidden. And while the world was forced to bow down to policies and mandates based on science that, well, was just plain old untrue, real information was forbidden. Given this history, we would expect the world to learn a key lesson, that the free flow of information is the lifeblood of a free society. Public scrutiny is what maintains the integrity of truth. And when the public is stripped of this right, what happens? The foundations of truth, they come falling down. But look, history always seems bound to repeat itself. The World Health Organization, as we speak right now, is working to get global authority to manage pandemics. And in the new guidelines on the preparedness and resilience for emerging threats, well, the infodemic is back. It states that as a form of community protection, it needs a form of infodemic management, as well as collaborative surveillance. It states this: infodemic cannot be eliminated, it can only be managed. This is why WHO and partners have developed the approach of infodemic management and armed with new capabilities for the job. It describes these as tools and approaches for social listening, and that includes, notably, artificial intelligence that monitors social media, as well as other systems such as experts for community engagement. Now, the problem, of course, isn't so much about official sources and so-called credible sources. The problem is when the official and credible sources are no longer held to public scrutiny. A monopoly on facts may sound appealing. Look, maybe it can help get rid of fake information. And look, I would agree, a society based on truth would be a wonderful thing. But the problem with truth is that there are often many views which arguably have some degree of truth within them. And few people, if any, can ever demonstrate complete truths. You'll always find gaps. You'll always find bias in perspective. But look, there's an even greater problem with this. It's in who gets to be the gatekeeper for truth. Who gets to make the calls on what is true and what is false? How can you ensure this monopoly will not get seized for special interest? We risk falling into the same problem as communist nations, where state-run media become the gatekeepers of public information. In the Soviet Union, the official paper, Pravda, they were the approved truth. When public scrutiny is forbidden, this is bound to cause two problems in logic. Is something false only because it's a risk to the official narrative? Can we believe something is true only because we're told so? Scrutiny is what reinforces truth, and without scrutiny, well, truth will always rest on shaky grounds. Folks, stay tuned after the break. We're speaking with Hans Mohnke, co-host of Truth Over News, about the Trump indictment.